Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Jürgen Moltmann in Plain English by Morrison. We're going to look at chapter 6, the first half, pages 137 to 161, make up chapter 6, on God in creation. And the first half deals with the first act of creation. We're going to study the first act of creation. Let's go to block 1, a doctrine of creation. The first act, God's kenosis, or his self-limitation, is the first act of creation. God's Sabbath is the crowning goal of creation. God's eschatological presence is the means of new creation. All to be fulfilled in the coming of God, the parousia. The eschatological means, Sabbath rest, leads us into God's eschatological redemption of the world. Sabbath rest is a foretaste of the future Sabbath rest, where God will be all in all. Sabbath rest is the goal of creation. We are redeemed with the earth and with the body. The earth is destined as God's habitation. It'll be a creation liberated from the bondage that it currently is under. The secret of creation is that there is the eternal indwelling of God in our midst. For those who see spiritually, we see a realm of spirit behind surface reality. We see a realm of transcendence behind surface reality. We see the eternal indwelling of God behind surface reality. Now, the first act of creation is kenosis, or self-limitation. And what Moltmann means by that is that in the beginning was God, and only God. In the beginning was God. And God is the way, the truth, and the life. No life can exist outside of God. And in the beginning there was God. So where was creation to take place? The first act of creation was to create space within the triune Godhead for creation to take place. So God limited himself, God contracted himself to create space for creation to even take place. It was a first act of love. It was a first act of agape, a first act of sacrificial love of God, limiting God's self to make room for creation to take place within God. Let's go on to block 2. Creation demands participation. The context for a doctrine of creation is God's self-limitation and God's eventual Sabbath rest, and the current ecological crisis and the current exhaustion of nature. Now, there has been a historic failure on the part of the church by teaching a biblical view of man's domination over nature, by not emphasizing nature as God's creation, and not emphasizing our role as the administrators of a trust and the need for participation. There's a necessity for an agape relationship. We know creation through participation. Earth must be protected for God's sake. We renounce all violence against nature, says Moltmann. We must renounce all violence against nature. Let's go on to block 3. The all-important block 3 where we wrap things up here. Understanding kenosis and God's self-limitation. Understanding the first act of creation. Self-limitation is related to God's pathos, to the divine passion. It is the first act of creation. God limits, and here you go, God limits and contracts himself out of a love for creation. So it can even take place. Creation is a process from kenosis to doxa glory, from self-contraction to self-expansion, where God will eventually become all in all. Creation has not yet reached its end. So God contracts himself to create space within himself for creation to take place, and then God interacts creatively with creation to lift it into perfect unification with the triune Godhead, where God will be all in his creation. So it's a movement from self-contraction to self-expansion, where God will eventually become all in all. So we're looking at from kenosis to doxa. Self-limitation means God contracts himself to make negative space for creation to take place. God makes room for finitude within himself, a space within which God will act creatively. God makes room for that which is not. It's an act of the divine passion. It is an act of the divine agape. The first act of creation is an act of sacrificial love, where God contracts himself to make room within himself for a creation to take place. And it'll be a creation that God will interact with creatively to lift it into perfect harmony with the Godhead. But there cannot be any life outside of God. If anything is cast outside of God, it's cast into second death. Anything outside of God is the darkness of second death. Life can only take place within God. God revealed to us in Jesus Christ that, what did Christ say? I am the way, the truth, and the life. There's no life outside the Godhead. To be cast outside the Godhead is to be cast into second death. So creation has to take place within God. In the beginning, there was God, and only God. So the first act of creation was an act of love, where God contracted himself to make room within himself for creation to even take place. God is agape. God is sacrificial love. The Son is the revelation of God as sacrificial love. The Holy Spirit is the power, the indwelling power of God as sacrificial love. A Holy Spirit that lifts creation into perfect reunification with the Father. Now the first half, this is Moltmann's God and Creation, and the first half of this book deals with the first act of creation. The second half is going to deal with the last act of creation, Sabbath rest. So we've got to look here at the first act of creation, and we're going to do a quick little recap and wrap up here. Let's go to block 1. Note 1, God's kenosis or self-limitation. In Greek, kenosis means self-limitation. It's the first act of creation. God's Sabbath is the last goal of creation. And the eschatological presence is the means of new creation. All to be fulfilled eventually in the coming of God, the parousia. Block 2. Note 3. The necessity of an agape relationship. We only know creation through participation. Earth must be protected for the sake of God's kingdom. We renounce all violence against nature. Period. I was raised that way by my father. My father raised me to respect nature. You don't throw a piece of, we're out in the woods, right? And it's snacking on a candy bar. You keep that wrapper in your pocket till you get home and throw it in the trash. Even in the middle of the woods, you don't throw a piece of paper down. My dad taught me my entire life, he taught me to respect and to love nature. We renounce all violence against nature. Block 3. Note 3. From kenosis to doxa. Self-limitation means God contracts himself to make negative space for creation to even take place. God makes room for finitude within himself. That's key. God makes room for finitude within himself. It's a space within which God will act creatively. God makes room for that which is not. This is an act of the divine passion. This is an act of the divine agape. Now, Moltmann, I learned this from Moltmann. Like I say, this is a refresher for me. I mean, I'm glad that I'm studying this book by Morrison. It's a great overview of Moltmann, but it's a great refresher for me to remind me just how much Moltmann taught me. But Moltmann admits that he got this doctrine of creation from Jewish theology. He borrowed it from Jewish theology. Jewish theology for years has taught that God's first act of creation was one of self-limitation. It came from Jewish theology. Moltmann brought it to the German theological realm. Then it was brought to America. And it's a tremendous book, a tremendous doctrine of creation. And this gives us the first half of God and creation, which addresses the first act of creation. Next, we will take a look at the second half, and it will address the final Sabbath goal of creation. And the two make up the chapter 6, pages 137 to 161. That's going to wrap up our look at understanding kenosis and God's self-limitation. Next time we'll pick up on the goal of the Sabbath.